Now we're going, okay, it's gonna start. You could admit everyone and we could, I'm gonna begin recording. Assalamu alaikum, good evening, welcome. How's everyone doing? Hopefully that you all will join us in this conversation. And this is an important discussion for us to have. I'm hearing myself back, so sorry, we'll see what the technical issues in there. But this conversation or this event really was inspired and started when a report that just came out in September 2021, which really the title of it, E-Occupation, How Social Media Corporations Enable Silence on Kashmir. And this report is groundbreaking for me because, again, it provided context on how social media companies, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and a whole host of others that are linked to it, have managed to allow India as a state to completely silence Kashmir and Kashmiris, and basically not allow communication to occur at a critical juncture where daily oppression is taking place, arrests, violation of all types of human rights, and even to say human rights is a very small.
It's pretty funny. Okay.
It's a really a different way to explain what people have said is a genocide that is unfolding, or a genocide watch in relations to Kashmir. But then the discussion evolved to think of also Palestine and Rohingya and the circumstances governing China and its treatment of the Rohingya Muslim minority, and also Palestine, where we see again social media companies deciding of what is permitted to be allowed to go on the platform on Facebook, what is allowed to be aired and it's not. And there are a number of reports from Facebook on a large number of messages, posts pertaining to Palestine and Kashmir that gets to be censored. Also, individuals that post on their Facebook pages and on their social platform tends to get suspended, and you have to appeal and go through the process, while the similar type of circumstances are not actually governed or treated in a similar way. And it seems that the social media companies have made a decision of which side of justice they stand on. They stand on the side that is actually amplify the voices of the oppressor, amplify the voices and the long hand of governments, and while suppressing and silencing the collective voices of those that are living under dire circumstances. So this debate and discussion is really started with this groundbreaking report on e-occupation of Kashmir, but thankfully for Stand With Kashmir activists and organizers that said we could have a conversation that speaks of Palestine and the Rohingya and have a larger discussion in relations to censorship in the social media space today. So I'm really delighted from the Islamophobia Studies Center for this conversation and for our guests. who are not only are coming just an outsider, but really they're committed, both intellectual scholars and activists that are not sitting in ivory tower and just theorizing, but actually are dealing with the issue from a frontline perspective and also from a looking at a community perspective. So I want to really invite first our dear colleague Iffat Ghazia. She's a third-year PhD student at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Her work at the intersection of technology and social sciences. She is also the founder and host of the Kashmir podcast. And I definitely would like to learn the technology of the podcast from you. You're one of the individuals that worked on this report. And I'm really, it's a treasure of work that is in our hands. So I turn it to you to really talk about the report and some of the key findings, but also I'm very interested in the set of recommendations because we need to make an impact on the policy level relative to both social media and government agencies. So please take it from us, for us.
Thank you so much, Professor Hatem, for having me. Thank you so much for hosting this conversation. I'm delighted to be here and very grateful that we have this platform to talk about the report and also have these cross conversations among each other on different kinds of social justice issues. So it's not a new thing that Kashmiri voices have been choked. There has always been a dearth of physical public spaces in Kashmir. And when internet was introduced, Kashmiris had this alternate space, an alternate public sphere where they could go and talk about issues when they have frustrations and anger, and also organize and have this kind of alternate social movement. But then part of the occupation of Kashmir also was this blackout of this online speech. And you all know that Kashmir has experienced the longest internet blockage ever enforced in a democracy. For 7 months of 2019 to 2020, the Indian government cut internet and phone connectivity to Kashmir. They did eventually restore slow 2G connectivity, but it came with limited access to a wide list of permitted internet sites. Obviously, the government cited concerns over terrorism, which is like their favorite excuse to give all the time to justify the blackout. But the net effect has been plunging more than 8 million people into a pre-internet age and to dividing families and friends from Kashmiris in the diaspora. I personally wasn't able to talk to my family for months during that time. Even now, mobile internet is regularly suspended during encounters. Wow, sorry, I was muted.
You got muted for a second. I don't know why, but go ahead.
So yeah, Indian government always uses these excuses of terrorism to justify internet blackouts in Kashmir, but the net effect has been plunging more than a population of more than 8 million people into this pre-internet era and to dividing families and friends from Kashmiris who are in the diaspora. I myself didn't speak to my family for months when all of this was happening. And even now, mobile internet is regularly suspended during encounters between Indian military and Kashmiris. And since 2012, more than 305 internet shutdowns have been reported from Kashmir region. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or any other social media platforms, they have continuously silenced Kashmiri voices in the digital space, especially since 2017. A common method of censorship involves the platform directly removing user content or restricting profiles at the behest of the Indian government, or they also do it in response to reports from other users. Aside from this, platforms have employed censorship methodologies that operate at an algorithmic level and elude any kind of detection, such as by restricting the reach of user content and manipulating search results. This new report by Stand with Kashmir basically calls out big tech companies like Facebook.
Go ahead.
So this report that you were also, you briefly mentioned about it, this report by Stand with Kashmir is basically calling out all these big tech companies, especially Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, for choking Kashmiri voices on digital platforms and thus being complicit and enabling the silence on Kashmir. The use of technology and its importance in social movements is very instrumental in understanding not just the sentiments of the public who use it, but also the motivations of the authoritarian government that controls it. While people on the ground have been completely silenced due to fear of arrests, attempts to silence Kashmiris in the diaspora has been the other step of the online conflict. Mass reporting of Kashmiri Twitter accounts or direct suspension by Twitter has lately become very common. Since January 2021, the account for Stand with Kashmir on Twitter was suspended twice, and so were the accounts of dozens of Kashmiri activists and academics. And to do all of this, like different governments use different kinds of tools to engage in different kinds of censorship. For example, if we talk about China, they use custom-made equipment to create its Great Firewall. Yemen purchased off-the-shelf software, and Palestinian authorities installed open source software to achieve the goal. And despite its global reputation for democracy, India is one of the biggest censors of the internet, a behavior almost universally accepted to be more characteristic of autocracies than democracies. For India, it's their Information Technology Act, which is also called IT Act 2000. And its section 66A could be basically used to criminalize anything that does not suit the authorities. It's very vague and you can basically fit in anything into it. India also achieves their censorship goals by directly ordering internet service providers, also known as ISPs, to block access to selected websites for its users within a certain, within its geographical reach. For example, since March 2021, the social media pages as well as the website for Stand with Kashmir remain geographically blocked from users in Kashmir and India. And Stand with Kashmir is one of the very few voices that continues to draw attention to human rights violations in the region. In this report, Stand with Kashmir published findings of their research where 62% of Kashmiris who participated said they experienced censorship on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The users registered different methods in which they were censored, including being removed permanently from platforms, their content pulled down, or their privileges restricted. All of them were given dishonest technical reasons for the cause of censorship, therefore impacting their trust in the political neutrality of the platforms. An online poll of SWK's Stand with Kashmir's 32,000 followers on Twitter and Instagram was conducted, where users were asked which platform they experienced censorship on. Out of the 311 responses, 62% said they experienced censorship of some kind on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. In another Instagram poll where 140 responses were logged, 19% said they experienced censorship on Twitter, 25% did on Facebook, and 44% did on Instagram. Kashmiri users said they were censored in different ways. User accounts were disabled, suspended, or permanently deleted. Users reported their account privileges were restricted or account content was removed. Users also said that platforms offer dishonest technical reasons for the censorship of their accounts. For example, in my case, when my account was disabled, they said I spam and manipulate their platform. That's why they suspended my accounts. The majority of Kashmiri users felt that these platforms, be it Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, they did not redress the censorship issues that were facing in an effective and timely, that they were facing in an effective and timely manner. And Kashmiri users said that they were harmed by social media platforms because the platforms were siding with Indian authorities. And censorship impacted the Kashmiri users' trust in the political neutrality of the platforms. So here is what the report recommends to social media organizations. Social media corporations must immediately reinstate all content removed and accounts suspended in violation of international norms of freedom of expression. Second, social media corporations must undertake a human rights impact assessment of the situation in Kashmir. which takes into account India's military occupation of Kashmir, its human rights record in the region, in particular, its history of blockading telecommunication services and its curtailment of Kashmiri people's political speech and expression. Such an assessment must inform the corporation's policies, products, programs, and partnerships in the region with regard to the protection of freedom of expression and protection of privacy. Third, corporations must investigate reports pointing to Indian government and political parties' long-standing use of IT cells for creating disinformation and suppressing marginalized populations in the digital space by trolling and mass reporting accounts. Disinformation and troll accounts must be removed from the platforms. Corporations must hire fact checkers to look at content pertaining to Kashmir with a human rights and anti-occupation lens. Corporations must make publicly available detailed information on content or removal requests by the Indian government or actors affiliated with it, including the number of requests received, the nature of the request, and the corporation's response to the request-making process. Number 6, corporations must provide transparency on the restriction or removal of users' content related to Kashmir-based or their current community standards, guidelines, or policy. 7, corporations must suspend the use of artificial intelligence mechanisms for review of Kashmir-related content. They must form ethics committee of independent Kashmiri researchers, scholars, and civil society groups with expertise in human rights and international law to review content removal and restrictions related to Kashmir, subject to data privacy and protection requirements. Number 8, corporations must designate specific staff members for conducting outreach with civil society groups and advocacy organizations in an issue-specific and need-based manner. Number 9, corporations must increase investment in Hindi language and Hinglish content moderation and create a database of hate speech and Islamophobic terminology that harms Kashmiris and marginalized populations in India. The internet platforms understand that they have constraints towards operating in some countries based on their government's censorious attitudes. At best, they work to make sure that the individuals and groups can express themselves even when governments object. For example, Facebook's celebration of its role in the Arab Spring. Platforms like Twitter need to understand that they are being used by the Indian government and their allies to silence Kashmiris and other vulnerable groups across the world. I have faced censorship, harassment, trolling, and doxing firsthand. And as an internet scholar, I can only hope that big tech companies stop being complicit in silencing voices that are critical of India's occupation in Kashmir. It's high time that social justice be promoted in all means possible and voice be given to those who struggle to remain visible and tell their stories. If you want to read the entire report, which I would really encourage you do, you can go to the Stand with Kashmir website and find it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Afat. And we'll get into some of the items and the issues you raised in the question and answer and discussion. So if people have questions, make sure to put your questions in the chat and we'll try to pick those up. I also may put a link in the chat to the full report, which is standwithkashmir.org and the full report. So I encourage people to access it, but more importantly, to share it, to send it to people in your immediate circle. If you're an educator, to share it with your classrooms, with your students, with your department. If you are connected to policy making, make sure to share the report with policymakers and so on. So it's very important for us to actually have such reports, have such data, and share it at the policy level and a social and civil society in general. So the link is there, and make sure also to share it, and maybe also post it on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram so they could see what they are doing in this sense. Our next speaker, it's a dear colleague of mine here at UC Berkeley, Professor Huma Dar. She's also an adjunct professor of critical studies at California College of the Arts. She's at the Department of Ethnic Studies and Gender and Women's Studies at UC Berkeley. Dar's paternal family was ethnically cleansed from Kashmir in 1948-49. So we could compare with the cleansing in Kashmir and the Nakba. So there's so much intertwining in there. Cleansed from Kashmir for their politics, supporting the Kashmiris' rights to self-determination, and maternal family exiled from Kashmir after accepting Islam during the Dogra regime, fought for independence from the British. So there's a wealth of both first-hand knowledge and linkages and connections to Kashmir. But I always have to say that Huma is always with us on the front line here at Berkeley and San Francisco State and across many parts of the Bay Area. So it's a pleasure to see you, Huma, and you could take it.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Assalamu alaikum, Hatem, Ifat, Rahama, everyone. And I just want to do actually a quick land acknowledgement, because it's not just that we Palestinians and Kashmiris share in our struggle for, to get rid of a very violent genocidal occupation and the desire for the right to self-determination and liberation, but also because my being based here makes my work possible, makes, I think many of you are based on the Turtle Island. It makes for me, it makes my living possible. It's what enabled me to raise my 2 children as a single mother and to be here to do this work. And so I want to acknowledge the Chochenyo, Karkin, Oloni people whose village, Lashon, I reside in, and people might know of that Lashon village as Berkeley. And I stand with them and I learn from them. And they are our kins along with Palestinians, all of us indigenous people fighting against settler colonialism. So thank you so much to actually Stand with Kashmir for doing this excellent research and really compiling this brilliant report and releasing it and at such an interesting time when we have that Facebook whistleblower, Frances Hogan, making all of these interesting insights that she's sharing about the Facebook algorithms, which, by the way, the word algorithm comes from al-Khwarizmi. So, I used to be in computer science, so there's stuff from that comes back. But I want to actually, she's not done enough. I would like to share how my analysis says a little bit more than what Frances Hogan has said. So in her analysis, she said that, and they have reports and they have full data, that how Facebook uses the algorithm that provokes violence, that highlights on our timelines, that highlights on the newsfeed those particular posts that catch our eyeballs, which is code for provoke anger or shock. And I would actually like to say that's very selective, because it does not happen for those of us who are oppressed. That provocative posts which are highlighted actually come from the powerful, dominant oppressors, which actually makes their algorithm way more scarier. It makes their nefarious intent of Facebook, Meta, whatever, a rose by any other name will smell as sweet, and Facebook by any other name will stink as bad. And so the fact that for example, my particular original Facebook account was permanently disabled in 2016 following the extrajudicial killing of a 22-year-old guerrilla fighter called Burhan Wani. To be honest, I did not think I would be targeted because my account is not based in India. I'm not based in India. I don't have an Indian passport. I don't live in India. They have no jurisdiction on me. I was, in fact, living in Menlo Park at that point, literally a mile away from the Facebook, very ugly headquarters. And my apologies to those who work in Facebook or who have friends who work in Facebook, because I do. I have friends who work in Facebook. And I never thought I would be, because the stuff I post on Facebook is the kind of stuff I teach, the kind of readings I give to my students. I have many times taught a course called Bollywood and the Terrorist, and at UC Berkeley, at UC Santa Cruz, etc. I've, so there was nothing inane, there was nothing out of the ordinary about what stuff I would post. And in that particular instance, I'd posted 4 photographs that journalists had sent me, and that were later on published by journalistic media reports and online portals, etc., of this immense funeral, the janaza that happened for this shaheed, the martyr. And the estimates were more than 700,000 people. So notice that the population of Indian occupied Kashmir at that point in 2016 was about anywhere between 8 and 9 million people. So it's almost like 1/10 of the people of Kashmir were out there in the middle of nowhere, not in a big city, at a time when all internet connection was cut off, at a time when there was people could not text each other, or they couldn't post stuff on Facebook, because Facebook, everything's internet was a clampdown, which is the usual thing that always happens in Kashmir. And all I posted was Inna lillahi wa inna ilaihi raji'un. From God we come, to God we return. And for any Muslim, any believer here, it's a very odd, it's the thing we're required to say for any living creature. All life that we believe, all life comes from the Creator, and to the Creator we return. And they never told me. So there were a few other Indian academics, I think Dibyesh Anand and a few other people had a form of slight censorship. They were not allowed to post for 2 weeks, or they had to, or some people had to show their identity papers, or show their driver's license or something. But for me, there was no warning. There was no temporary pause in my ability to post articles. It was just gone. And I was stunned. And the person who actually warned me about, Huma, are you okay? Your account is gone. And I was like, no, that can't be, is here in the audience, Professor Shaista Patel. And that's how I got to know that my account is gone. And compare this to the kind of posts that Hindutva posts, the kind of posts that Modi posts, the kind of posts that, or Facebook posts and Twitter and tweets that many Indians post on Twitter, on Facebook. The danger level for this was nothing. The only thing that my post was doing was, it was showing to the world who's a terrorist and who isn't. Because by definition, a terrorist is one who terrorizes civilians. Here is 1/10 of the population. So imagine if in the US, 33 million people showed up for somebody's funeral. That was the kind of adoration and support we were showing our military guerrilla fighter. And who's the terrorizer? It was obviously the Indian regime. And for that boo-boo, for that faux pas, my account was gone. So their algorithms are much more nefarious. I've gotten rape threats, murder threats, all kinds of horrifying, terrible threats. And those people, Facebook has never done anything to them. Twitter, truth be told, it does sometimes suspend those accounts. So at least I'm grateful to Twitter for that. Although Twitter too tries to intimidate us. I've received emails a couple of times pointing to, these particular tweets of yours, Humadar, might be in transgression of the Indian law. So, and I have to wonder, why would the possibility that something I say is in transgression of Indian law or Burmese law or North Korean law, why would that be applicable to me? Why is Facebook acting as the handmaiden of this fascist, genocidal, mass murderer, Modi, whose hands are stained in blood? they're stained in Muslim blood. You know, it's unbelievable. So Facebook's Islamophobia, Facebook's selective highlighting of provocative posts against Muslims, and selective squelching of free speech and actual journalistic news for people who are oppressed, is that has not come out in Frances Haugen's whistleblowing. And so that, I'm not feeling very well, but I wanted this to be my contribution to this discussion here. And I hope we can highlight that further with Frances Haugen's, what she said, to fine tune it better. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Huma. And hopefully we'll get back to some of the questions that are coming in. Some of them are on Facebook, on our chat, but some are also, I'm going to call on people to ask. So I'm going to shift to our dear colleague, Rama Kodaimi, is the campaign director of the Crescendo Project at the Action Center on Race and the Economy, which focuses on corporate complicity in Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry. Previously, Rama was the deputy director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, where we often crisscrossed and met each other both in DC as well as more in Chicago as well. So Rama, go ahead and take us into the conversation.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you.
Wa alaikum assalam.
To be with you, and really, really happy to be working with Stand with Kashmir on this amazing report you all just put up, and really thankful for the people putting up questions. There's definitely a good time for discussion. So what I'm going to do is step back a little, particularly in terms of just thinking about the questions in terms of why Facebook might be doing that, and thinking about tech in general about why they're doing this. So something to note is none of these platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, really existed pre 9/11, which is fascinating because they take up so much of our lives, but literally only in the past 20 years that they really become prominent in our day-to-day. And it's important to note that their business model is to allow right-wing propaganda, especially Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry, to run rampant on their platforms. That is what their business model is. They make money off of people logging on and staying on longer and longer and engaging with material that unfortunately tends to make people hate people more, and then tend to commit violence against our communities, whether it's Muslim communities, Black and brown communities, immigrant communities, the list goes on and on. Part of that business model is also then serving states who are also in the last 20 years have been really oppressive toward Muslim communities across the globe. And so a project that I'm going to talk a little bit more about is that we did at Crescendo with our partners Empower Change and Little Sis, is a project we called Big Tech Sells War. And what we are doing with this project is, as people were marking 20 years of the war on terror earlier in September and talking about the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, there was a lot of discussion about what this war on terror means. Now, is it finally ending because the troops are coming home from Afghanistan? A war on terror that obviously was launched by George W. Bush, but then Obama made it his own, Trump made it his own, and now Biden himself is crafting it into his own. And if we all remember, because we all lived through it, that after 9/11, the entire apparatus of the U.S. government really shifted to counterterrorism, with complete support from media, universities, think tanks, and culture institutions, and also a lot of corporations ended up profiteering off of this. And it became an all-out assault on Muslim communities in the US and abroad. To be clear, it wasn't that as if the framework of terrorism came new in a post 9/11 world. Obviously, it's been used before that to repress Black freedom fighters, Kashmiri liberation, Palestinian liberation, etc. But in a post 9/11 world, we saw that Muslims, particularly of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, became a primary target of this global war on terror, as communities across the globe were labeled as terrorists, and what became an essential part of paving the way for repressive policies and practices to be implemented against Muslims, but also all other communities, some of which actually, have long histories, such as surveillance and criminalization. And this took many forms: wars, invasions, torture, etc. We can talk more about that. And also, to be clear, it was not only the US that was doing this. India, China, Russia regimes in Israel, Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, etc., all use terrorism to repress Palestinians, Yemenis, Syrians, Kashmiris, and their own citizens. Part of also, though, that I want to again talk about why corporate angle of this, it wasn't only the policies in the states that were benefiting from this. There was what some people have called as terror capitalism that really grew out of the war on terrorism. This idea that Muslims and others worldwide had to become dehumanized as terrorists in order to justify their repression, and then the need to fight terrorism all the time everywhere created a profit motive for corporations. And so these corporations can come in and say, we're going to continue to put profit over people and provide the tools necessary for these wars and repressive policies to be carried out. And many times when you think about that in a 9/11 context or war context, we think about weapons manufacturers, which is rightly so. They deserve much of the attention when we talk about war profiteers, and the US is the largest arms exporter in the world. But in a post 9/11 world where we saw the growing role, for example, of artificial intelligence and drones in warfares, when we consider that war in our communities in this last 20 years was more than just dropping bombs, but also mass surveillance, criminalization, it becomes clear that big tech has been complicit in terms of how these war profiteers and how big tech sells war. So what we did with this research is look at contracts post 9/11 between government agencies that run the global war on terror. So we're talking about the Pentagon, Department of Homeland Security, State, Department of Justice, and big tech corporations. We're talking about household names like Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Twitter, names of products, whose products, services, and platforms we use every day. And what we found that while these tech companies were becoming more prominent in our daily lives over the last 20 years, they were making huge profits, providing tools to the US military and government to help fuel their war on Muslim and other Black and brown communities at home and abroad. So since 2004, we found that the agency spent at least $44.5 billion, these government agencies, with contracts with these big tech companies. And we're talking about these contracts have steadily grown over the years. So for example, from 2007 to 2009, DHS contracts and some contracts with these tech corporations increased by 50-fold. And during the Trump administration from 2017 to 2019, the Pentagon nearly doubled their contracts and contracts with these tech corporations. Amazon signed nearly 5 times and Microsoft signed nearly 8 times as many federal contracts and some contracts in 2019 compared to 2015. So there's been a growing demand for big tech services during the global war on terror, and that far outpaced that of traditional contractors and weapons manufacturers like Raytheon and Northrop Grumman. So again, it seems like what we're trying to put out there is big tech is really making money off of war on our communities, and what 9/11 has provided for them is that opportunity to really grow that part of their work. In addition to just the contracts and the profiteering, we also found that there's a revolving door between US government agencies running the global war on terror and big tech jobs. So hundreds of people have rotated in and out of government and tech jobs in the past 20 years. And this is important because if you're, as we know, when you're like moving from government to tech or from tech to government, your priorities get mixed up and it becomes a problem because who is determining what? And there's definitely a conflict of interest in that. And so those are kind of 2 lessons that we brought from this research. And I will add to that, since we've been talking about social media and the report from Stand with Kashmir, again, that rampant spread of Islamophobia since the global war of terror is part of what these platforms have also done. And unfortunately, they profit from that as well. So think about Google as an example. So YouTube has been found guilty of helping spread Islamophobia and right-wing ideology. And while on the one hand, Google can create the artificial intelligence for military drones to target Muslims, they can also perpetuate the criminalization of that very same community by spreading the anti-Muslim bigotry on their platform like YouTube. And so Google can profit from both creating the conditions to make an enemy, quote unquote, of Muslim communities, while also creating then the machinery that can target and kill them. And so like that's good, very, when you think about it, that's just how wrong of it is that these tech companies are able to make this. And then at the same time, they censor our activism as as has already been talked about, and think about, and Kashmir has been talked about, think about Palestine is another big example of that. Just back in May, we saw so many stories while Israel was bombing Gaza once again of Palestinians and Saudi activists having their posts removed from Facebook and Instagram. Hamle, which is a Palestinian org that does digital rights work, documented more than 500 reports of Palestinian political speech and narrative online being censored. Either content was either removed, reduced, and restricted. Hashtags were hidden, archived, deleted. Most of those reports came from Instagram and Facebook, though Twitter also got a lot of things. Or there have been efforts by anti-Palestinian organizations to get Facebook to censor discussion of Zionism by labeling it as anti-Semitism. We've seen entire channels documenting war crimes in Syria that have been shut down, jeopardizing efforts for accountability and justice. Research has found that Facebook was complicit in the genocide of the Rohingya people, or YouTube actually inspired the shooter in the 2019 Christchurch massacre that killed over 50 mosque worshippers. And again, because there's a complete disregard to content moderation of right-wing and anti-Muslim content, while white supremacist groups are allowed to flourish on these platforms. Again, they openly planned the attack on the Capitol back in January, and nothing, that continues to be wrong because everyone was focused in on the terrorism, i.e. Muslim content that continues to be constrained due to these terrorism reports. And I'll just end kind of on a note, and I hope this leads to the discussion of kind of thinking about what we do in this moment. I think what's important is to realize tech is not neutral. There have been efforts that continue to try to make this effort. Again, the report from Stand with Kashmir is a very clear example of that. And more examples. And so we need to organize against this idea that tech is not neutral and really be inspired by efforts like No Tech for ICE or No Tech for Apartheid, and workers in these tech platforms like Google, Amazon, that are really taking it upon themselves to realize that actually there is a problem with the product we are creating. And it's time to rethink the way tech is being run and really push us. I think maybe it is time that we also reimagine who owns this tech. Tech makes money off of us. They make money off of our collecting our data, off of our networks, our posts, our views. And maybe it's time we take ownership of that, since without us, they will not exist.
I need to unmute right now. Thank you, Rama, for putting a context and linking the social media and social media companies with the war and terrorism, the military-industrial complex, and all the different linkages that are there. A number of questions really are put forth, and they're in essence saying what can be done. And I know that the report has some 9 solid recommendations, and maybe we could take some of these recommendations, especially like the one about social media corporations must undertake a human rights impact assessment of the situation in Kashmir. So if we could say, how would that take place? What will be the impact? Because there are some comments says talk is not enough, we need to do something, and I can understand the urge for taking action. But that recommendation seems to be putting on really a spot to have social media companies do a human rights assessment of the impact of the situation in Kashmir, but we could also speak of Palestine or the Rohingya. So if anybody would like to really take that second recommendation and expand upon it, maybe if you want to come back and talk about that and how do we foresee it, and maybe also giving direction to people of how to put pressure on policymakers to bring this into actuality. Are you with us? Ifat, are you? I don't see.
Yeah, so I was not able to unmute myself. I was asking you to unmute me.
Oh, sorry.
It's fine. I mean, to deal with any problem, basically, I mean, even if you have computer science engineers or you have people in social sciences and you want them to deal with a certain problem sitting in United States or any Western country, they won't be able to figure it out unless they really know what's happening on the ground. And that's exactly what this recommendation is asking big tech platforms to do. I mean, if you look at companies like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, there are a lot of Indians who work in these tech companies, but I can maybe count on my fingers if there are any Kashmiris working in such companies or Palestinians. So we need to have, as much as, today I was reading an article on Tech Policy Press, is it okay to work for Facebook, as Huma was also mentioning it. And I went through that entire article. Like, I always have these like ethical considerations, like, is it good to go and work in Facebook and all these big tech platforms? Because we do want a representation and we do want to fix things. And we want them to have these, for example, to fix these things. Essentially, the person who is there should know Kashmir, not just like textbook Kashmir, whatever they consume from the internet or from the news. They should know the place from inside, right? And then only they'll be able to like explain to their further teammates, and maybe they'll create some kind of a machine learning model to like detect censorship, or to make platforms like Facebook and Twitter safer for Kashmiri users, or any dissidents from any part of the world who try to be visible on these social media platforms and who face a lot of censorship. So I think essentially, I mean, of course, it's like so complicated if you, whether you want to go in these platforms and fix things by yourself, or how do you educate them about the things on ground and ask and demand of them to fix these things. I don't know who just said it. I think Rama, we always say this, if you're not paying for it, then like you are the product of it. That's how like we are for social media. I mean, we are not paying for our accounts, but they are definitely making a lot of money on us. So it's like, it's high time like we demand credibility and accountability from them, and also sort of try to have a seat on the table, maybe not necessarily working with them, but maybe through policymakers or something, but just try to tell them and make them understand what exactly is happening and why it's their responsibility to fix it, and not just evade it and say, whatever, we don't understand it. If you don't understand it, shut your company. I mean, it's your job to learn and understand all the nuances and then fix it. I mean, you can't have some AI mechanism in place to like clean the internet or, moderate the content or something. AI can't do a good job at moderating, and neither can humans who don't know much. So how do you fill the gap? How do you have people who, you can't just ask somebody sitting in Philippines, as they have like these how they rent these third-party resources in countries like Philippines to moderate content on their platforms. You can't have people in Philippines moderating something about Kashmir when they know nothing about it. And that's why a simple post like Huma's, where she's just like, sort of saying to Allah we belong and to Allah we go back, it goes suspend, it goes off from Facebook, and her account goes off the platform. So there are a lot of things that have to go there. And I was looking at the comments, and people say, what happens with talking? A lot happens with talking. Policies change and things change only when people start talking about things. So talking, as much as maybe we get bored by listening to each other, but it's very important to have these conversations and to have these things out there. Like Palestinians, Kashmiris, or any dissident groups need to have a seat on the table and talk about these things and get the policies changed and force them to change the policies, because we consume this internet. We need it to have a place in the world to tell our story. So we also need it to be safe for us. And that's why I strongly feel like the recommendations by Stand with Kashmir, I mean, they're totally doable. It's not like they're asking something a lot and it's not achievable. It's totally achievable if more people start talking about it and start sharing the report, start asking like-minded people for the same, bring people from policy on the table. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I have another question, and anyone can jump to answer it. It says, this is from Adam Carroll. It says, working for the Muslim American NGOs Justice for All, I'm glad to see a discussion focusing attention on technology's impact on the human rights of Muslim minorities. He says, yes, social media is a vehicle for violence against Muslims in India and against the Rohingya in Burma. Clearly, the technological aspect of oppression is also manifested in mass surveillance of the Uyghur, as well as other occupied population. While Israeli companies like Pegasus have shared repressive tools with a range of authoritarian governments, Facebook and Google have their own history of complicity and inaction. what can the United Nations do to rein in these abuses on a global scale? And if there is action, what timeline is possible? So in essence, thinking of the United Nations, and I know many of us have what you call conflicted feelings toward the United Nations, but as an agency that really represents the place where the world community engages. So what can the United Nations do? And what type of demands we could put on the United Nations as an international body? Again, anyone can jump to this question.
Maybe I can say
Yeah,
a little bit, Hatim, here. So United Nations, as we know, it doesn't have too many teeth, that it's not really able to back its resolutions, but that depends on us. And there are, in the case of Kashmir, there are resolutions passed by the United Nations that Kashmiris should be allowed to vote and determine our future. So insisting on that, on those plebiscites to take place, I think is something that United Nations can do. And it's a soft diplomacy. The good name, like India, it's mind-boggling that despite its genocidal policies in Indian occupied Kashmir, as well as on Dalits and Indian Muslims in Manipur, many other places. So Kashmir is not the only place that it has genocidal policies, and yet it has the audacity to want a permanent place in the Security Council, to want a permanent place and that veto power, despite its history of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And that's where I think having a space to be able to talk about the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, that different state oppressors have done throughout, including in Kashmir, including in on the Rohingyas in Burma, where we bring it to the attention that, hey, this is all that has been happening. And therefore, India did not actually get that permanent seat on the Security Council. And there have been 2 reports out of United Nations Human Rights Council, which is, in the case of Kashmir, this is a novel thing. They had kept quiet for decades. And many of them cite Facebook and tweets, and many of them cite local media that would not have come to their attention because they're not allowed to go into Indian occupied Kashmir. But they were brought to the attention of the United Nations special rapporteurs through social media. So we should not discount the power of social media, extremely problematic as it is. And there is a conversation happening in chat, which Ifat also talked about, and Muhammad Nizam has excellent suggestions about what to do to organize this kind of a boycott, divestment from India. Except that, in all of those, we're not asking this event, talking about censorship and social media and technology and Islamophobia and how technology sides with settler occupations. It's not mutually contradictory. We are not saying don't do that. In fact, those are really, really important points that all of us should take to heart. But many of those are enabled, facilitated precisely by social media, political education, the ability to organize, the ability to bring to attention of other people, precisely happens as it has been happening via social media. Because in the case of Kashmir, the journalists are forced to keep their lips zipped up. A very close friend of mine, a prominent journalist in Kashmir, his home was raided a couple of months ago, and all electronic devices, not just his own laptop or desktop or phone, but his wife's, in the entire family's electronic devices were taken away by the Indian occupying forces, and all paperwork, all photographs, all pictures, all children's birthdays he has 2 children, so 2 kids, Hilal Mir, his kids' birthday photographs were taken away by the Indian occupying forces. And he said, forget about the devices, forget about the data I had on my phone or my laptop. I'm worried about missing the memories of my first child's first birthday. And I think it behooves us. We are sitting here where these technologies are based, where Facebook and Twitter have their headquarters, precisely actually in San Francisco, in the Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area. It is our responsibility to do as much as we can to teach people and to start a movement if need be, to dismantle these Islamophobic strategies that they have been deploying, and very colonial, imperial, casteist strategies that they have been deploying against people in South Asia, at least.
Rama, I think you were wanting to jump in. I don't know why you were muted. But again, just wanted to emphasize that we wanted the discussion to really center the report and the findings that have been done by Stand with Kashmir, and then broaden the conversation about the Rohingya and Palestine in order to understand what e-occupation means. And hopefully the information, the materials that we have from this conversation and others will be used by people who want to take different actions and possibly utilize different strategies. Because I see that the conversation possibly is going that we're just talking and therefore where is the action? This again is the research. This is a report to get it in people's hand and to ask people to share it with some of the key findings and the material. We find that many people often don't know what is taking place, and not knowing about what is taking place can impact the type of strategies that you want to deploy. So I just want to make sure that we understand the purpose of this meeting. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Rama.
thank you for that, Dr. Hatem. And talking is the first step to organizing, for sure. And I think just the point in terms of like why tech focus is important. I think we have power as users of all of these technologies, and I really want to like stress like let's use that power. Obviously, you know, a lot of us do policy work, which is important too, but let's reimagine the other powers we have. And tech also is a very great way to really link the very local stuff that you can do with the national stuff with the global stuff. So take a tech company like Amazon, for example. So locally, Amazon, through their Ring technology, might be partnering with the local police department to help spy on us, particularly Black and brown communities locally. So that's a very local way that you can organize around ending those partnerships with your local police departments. And then you take it on a national level. Amazon provides services to ICE, which then leads to militarized borders, the separation of families. So what does that mean in terms of then linking up to that bigger problem on a national scale of harm to our communities? And then on a global level, Amazon has recently, back in May, signed a contract, them and Google signed a contract with the Israeli military and government to provide web services and cloud services to the government and the military, Israel military. So again, there's like that angle of that. And so this is one company that's causing all of this harm. And it's an opportunity for us to link all of these things together. And that's how action starts, and do something very locally that eventually is going to have that ripple effect on that international level. And then the UN question made me think also like, you know, even as the state and these tech companies do work hand in hand, the state also does have a role to regulate these. And there are attempts now to, especially on the anti-monopoly level, to break these companies down. Because one problem is these companies are so big. And they understand that being big is a problem. So at the end of 2020, Susan Wojcicki, who's the CEO of YouTube, was like explaining in their annual report, like, of course, we're going to have problems with like continuing hate and extremism on our site because we're just so big. And then she went on to explain how they're going to get even bigger. So it's like, well, why are you continuing to get bigger if you know there's a problem? And so I think there is a way similar to like the UN question of like, how do we use governments to regulate and break apart these tech companies, which is not going to be the end of the problem. The racism and the Islamophobia isn't going to go away just because they're smaller. But it is, I think, an important attempt to really talk about part of the problem is how big these companies are.
I think Lauren Ben Hamida is saying, could the Supreme Courts of India's recent decision about Pegasus indicate that some powerful people in India now realize that they are all vulnerable to the same abuses that the Kashmiris suffer? All right. So again, the issue of Pegasus and this intrusion, and then there was also the report that came out, I think yesterday or the day before, about Israel monitoring all of the Palestinian communication, all their phone conversations, facial recognition, and also in incentivizing their military personnel to actually undertake this type of massive surveillance. So anyone like to jump on this? And I know we're getting closer to wrapping up, but this question is interesting. Whether is there cracks within India's political judicial elite, or is just this is a one-off type of response?
Can I quickly respond to that a little bit, Hatem? So, you know, the category progressive except for Palestine, and there's another analogous category, progressive except for Kashmir, and many Indian civil rights leaders are progressive on many issues except for Kashmir. And so, their judicial activism doesn't apply to Kashmir. I mean, a very flagrant example is that the illegal derogation of Article 370 and Articles 35A that happened on August 5th, 2019 has been in the Supreme Court since more than 2 years now, and not a single hearing has happened. That was an urgent issue that they're illegally occupying. They were occupying Kashmir before that with a figment of legal fig leaf. At this point, that fig leaf was ripped apart on August 5th, 2019, and they're okay with this. They're installing in just the Srinagar city, the capital of Indian occupied Kashmir. I read a news article 3 weeks ago, 300 CCTVs armed with the state-of-the-art facial recognition technology from Israel, which would immediately, and with their card, that it would immediately read who is walking, who came out of their door, did they go into their lawn, because they have drones flying all over Kashmir. And along with the CCTVs, whatever we do, if we go to a library or a bookstore or a post office or visit friend, who's our friend, who did we go out with, is all being recorded. And they plan to record even more. And did the civil rights activists in India respond to that? No, they did not.
I wanted to bring something up before we wind up. I don't know if I was able to articulate it properly before. The fact that big tech always sides with India, because obviously India is a huge market for them, and they do not have any reason to side with us, Kashmiris, which is like a forgotten lot of people, just a few people using technology who barely have technology. And even if they have internet, they struggle to survive and have this visibility on social media. They're obviously not going to take our side, and they always side with the Indian government because they have this huge market that India provides them. So it's not like they don't know what's happening. If they can hire so many engineers and so many people to get these platforms running, they can obviously invest some resources in educating themselves about places like Kashmir. But they don't do it. It's not like they don't do it. They just ignore it. They don't want to deal with it because, again, it doesn't feed their capitalist agendas. So again, bringing me to the same point, yes, talking does help. It does help in policy. It does help in getting people together and pushing them that they can't ignore it anymore, and they really need to attend to this and fix this.
Thank you. So we're coming to wrap up this conversation. It's really just a drop in the larger conversation and the work that needs to be done. So let me go back in order. So Rama, if you could just take us some concluding remarks, and if there's any specific action that you want people to do relative to your work.
Yeah, thank you so much for this discussion, and really, again, honored to be working with Stand with Kashmir on some of these issues. I think I would just reiterate, like we should use the power we have to really, you know, organize against these tech companies, because they cannot exist without us. Even though now they're putting their profits ahead of us, they're preferring to work, you know, and serve state interests ahead of us, and without us, they can't work at all. And so, and I will drop this link again to our Big Tech Sells War website, because there's plenty of information there, and also a link to take action to learn more, particularly a call to asking big tech to stop selling war on our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Rama. And Huma?
Well, I'd just like to say that, you know, for all of us to really get active in also talking to the Congress people who represent us, because even that can have a little effect. The US is selling tons and tons of weapons to India, just like Israel. India is the largest purchaser of weapons from the US, from Israel, from France, and from Russia. And so they get money there and they don't want to rock the boat. But when people are more aware of what's happening and of the genocidal occupations that are being enabled by these armed technologies, I think it embarrasses the Congress a little bit, and it can have some effect in withholding certain sales of weapons that they sell. So here's something.
Thank you, Huma.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Effat?
Thank you so much for hosting this very important conversation. You see how Israel, India, or even US, how oppressors side with each other to further oppress people. It's high time that the oppressed people also side with each other and take up each other's causes and talk about each other's causes as much as we talk about our own, and build this international solidarity for each other. And there are a lot of great resources on the Stand with Kashmir website for anybody who wants to learn more about what's happening in Kashmir. They have a wonderful Kashmir syllabus and so many other like campaigns and resources. The link is here in the chat. Please visit their website, and I'm sure you'll find a lot of informative content to update yourselves. And thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you, Effat. Thank you, Huma. Thank you, Rama. This is an enriching conversation, but it's a start. I will ask people one thing and one thing only right now, is that you access the report from Stand with Kashmir and share it. Unfortunately, share it on social media. Populate your page on Facebook. Share it on Twitter, on Instagram. And also continue to follow the development. I'm from Palestine. I follow constantly Palestine, but I also follow Kashmir and what is taking place. It is often sometimes those of us that are outside that are able to act in our limited capacities that can make a difference. So don't downplay the small act that you could undertake of sharing, of talking, even mentioning the term Kashmir in places where it might not be mentioned might result in a conversation on a spark of a point that will make a difference. This is a long-term struggle, and we need to be committed to it in all of our capacities. So I'd like to thank you, thank all of us, all of our speakers, our participants, and everybody that's joined us. May God continue to bless you and continue to tune to our Islamophobia's Studies Center and all the work that we do. We try to amplify sound research, sound messages, and sound information. Free Kashmir, free Palestine, free Rohingya, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring ease to all the sufferings across the world. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Thank you so much, Hatem. That was really generous of you to host.
Oh, it's a